I would also like to thank Rebecca Compton for her support and for the attention with which she accompanied the preparation of this initiative. I would also like to convey the greetings of Riccardo Britti, Director of the Department of the Arts, who unfortunately cannot be with us today because of other institutional commitments. I would also like to acknowledge my colleague Federica Muzzarelli, whose contribution was important in helping make this event possible and in fostering the collaboration between the University of Bologna and the Italian Art Society. We are especially pleased to welcome Sim Roberts, who will deliver today's lecture, Michelangelo, Francia, and the Problem of the Metal, devoted to a topic of a great interest for the study of Italian art between the 15th and 16th centuries. Thank you all very much for being here, both in person and online. I wish you all a wonderful lecture. Thank you so much, and I leave the floor.
Grazie, dottor Fabio Massaccesi, per la gentile introduzione. Buon pomeriggio a tutti e tutte. Io sono Lucia Colombari, assistant professor di storia dell'arte presso la University of Oklahoma, ma oggi sono qui con voi in qualità del membro del CDA e tesoriere della Italian Art Society. Per coloro che non conoscono la nostra organizzazione, la IAS, come l'acronimo che userò per questa breve introduzione, è un'organizzazione americana che si prefigge lo scopo di studiare e valorizzare la storia dell'arte italiana dall'antichità ad oggi. La presidente della IAS, la dottoressa Ancia Gamble, mi ha chiesto di leggere il discorso di benvenuto per il nostro pubblico italiano. Benvenuti a tutti coloro che sono presenti oggi, sia coloro che sono qui con noi all'Università di Bologna, sia tutti voi che vi unite da remoto su Zoom per la 15ª conferenza annuale di IAS Press. Dal 2010 la Italian Art Society collabora con la Samuel H. Kress Foundation a un ciclo di conferenze volto a promuovere lo scambio intellettuale tra gli storici dell'arte del Nord America e la comunità internazionale di studiosi che vivono o lavorano in Italia. Siamo profondamente grati per il continuo sostegno che la Kress Foundation riserva a questo ciclo di conferenze. Desideriamo inoltre cogliere l'occasione per congratulare Lisa Schermerhorn per la sua recente nomina a presidente della Kress. L'ultima volta che questa conferenza annuale si è tenuta a Bologna risale a quasi un decennio fa, nel 2017. Quest'anno la IAS è entusiasta di collaborare con la Scuola di Specializzazione in Beni Storico Artistici per riportare l'evento proprio qui a Bologna. Un enorme ringraziamento va ai nostri ospiti, la dottoressa Federica Muzzarelli e il dottor Fabio Massaccesi, per il lavoro svolto al fine di organizzare questa conferenza nella nostra città. Desidero inoltre esprimere la mia più sincera gratitudine alla nuova coordinatrice eventi della IAS, la dottoressa Rebecca Compton, per l'impegno profuso nell'assicurare il perfetto svolgimento di questa conferenza e del ricevimento che seguirà. Rebecca ha assunto questo incarico soltanto lo scorso febbraio, rivelandosi fin da subito un'aggiunta preziosa e straordinaria al nostro team. Prima di presentare il nostro relatore, il dottor Sean Roberts, vorrei dedicare un momento per ringraziare anche tutti i nostri soci. Senza di voi, la IAS semplicemente non esisterebbe. Il prossimo anno ricorrerà il 40° anniversario della nostra organizzazione. Nel corso degli ultimi 4 decenni, la IAS è cresciuta e si è evoluta e ha ampliato il proprio ambito di interesse. Dall'epoca medievale e della prima età moderna siamo passati a includere l'arte antica fino a quella contemporanea, accogliendo così nell'organizzazione studiosi e studiose come me e Ancia. Per celebrare questo traguardo, il prossimo anno organizzeremo alcuni eventi speciali. Vi invitiamo dunque a continuare a seguirci per ulteriori sviluppi. Oltre a tutti i nostri soci ordinari, desidero rivolgere un ringraziamento particolare ai soci delle categorie patrona, fautrice e donatrice, i quali si adoperano con straordinaria generosità per sostenere la missione della IAS. Inoltre, un enorme ringraziamento ai nostri attuali membri istituzionali, tra i quali figurano, senza un ordine particolare, il Dipartimento di Storia dell'Arte della Temple University, il Newcomb Art Department della Tulane University, il Dipartimento di Storia dell'Arte del Dartmouth College e il Dipartimento di Storia dell'Arte della Musica della Syracuse University. Se non siete ancora membri della IAS, vi invitiamo a unirvi a noi per contribuire a sostenere ulteriormente la ricerca sull'arte e l'architettura italiana. Attualmente, con la nostra Campaign for 600, puntiamo a raggiungere i 600 membri entro la fine del 2026. Un ringraziamento al responsabile delle membership, dottor Nick Camerlenghi, e alla responsabile dello sviluppo, dottoressa Cheryl Rees, per il lavoro svolto a tal fine. Disponiamo davvero di un team straordinario, capace di rendere possibile ogni nostra iniziativa. Tra essi anche la nostra vicepresidente esecutiva, dottoressa Kelly Wood, anche lei oggi qui presente. Senza ulteriori indugi, desidero presentarvi il relatore di oggi, il dottor Sean Roberts. Sean Roberts è un ex presidente della IAS e attualmente ricopre la carica di Teaching Professor presso la School of Art della Università del Tennessee a Knoxville. I suoi saggi su stampe, mappe, dipinti e opere di oreficeria italiane sono apparsi su riviste quali Renaissance Studies, Print Quarterly, Source e Material Cultural Review. È autore e coautore di numerosi libri, tra cui Printing a Mediterranean World, Florence, Constantinople and the Renaissance of Geography, pubblicato con Harvard nel 2013, e co-curatore di Visual Cultural Secrecy in Early Modern Europe, pubblicato con Penn State nel 2013. Con Yale, il dottor Roberts ha pubblicato nel 2021 il volume The Seas and the Mobility of Islamic Art e nel 2023 The Environment, Ecology and Islamic Art. Tra i suoi progetti in corso figurano la biografia del cartografo rinascimentale Gerardo Mercatore, la cui pubblicazione è prevista per la fine del 2027 in Breton Books, e una monografia scientifica sul pittore e orafo bolognese Francesco Francia. È proprio quest'ultima ricerca su Francia il tema dell'intervento di oggi, dal titolo Francia, Michelangelo and the Problem of Metal. Ora, la presidente della IAS, dottoressa Ancia Gamble, vi darà il benvenuto in inglese. Grazie.
Thanks so much, Lucia. Glad that. Welcome to everyone here today, both those of us here at the University of Bologna and all of y'all joining us remotely on Zoom for the 15th Annual IAS Kress Lecture. Since 2010, the Italian Art Society has worked with the Samuel H. Kress Foundation on a lecture series to promote the intellectual exchange among art historians from North America and the international community of scholars living and working here in Italy. We are so grateful for the continued support of the Kress Foundation for this lecture series, and I want to take a moment to congratulate Lisa Schemmerhorn on her recent appointment as the latest president of Kress. The last time the IAS Kress was here in Bologna was almost a decade ago in 2017. This year, the IAS is excited to be partnering with the Scuola di Specializzazione. Let's see if I can pronounce it. Specializzazione di Beni Storico Artistici to bring the lecture back here to Bologna. Huge thank you to our hosts, Dr. Federica Muzzarelli and Fabio Massacesi, to their work in bringing the lecture here. In addition, I want to say an absolutely huge thank you to our brand new IAS events coordinator, Rebecca Compton, for all of her work making this happen and run so smoothly. She only started in February, and she's already been an amazing addition to the team. Lastly, I want to take a moment to thank my colleague here, Dr. Lucia Colombari, who is our treasurer for the IAS and a native Bolognese, for making the introductions that made this event happen here at the university. Before I introduce our speaker, Dr. Sean Roberts, I want to take a moment to also thank our IAS members. Without you, the IAS won't exist or wouldn't exist. Next year is our 40th anniversary. So Italian Art Society will be 40. Over the course of the past 4 decades, the IAS has grown and changed, including widening the scope from medieval and early modern, expanding to ancient to present, which brought scholars like Lucia and I into the organization. We will have some special events to celebrate next year, so keep an eye out for those. In addition to our regular members, I want to especially thank our Padrona, Fautrice, and Donatrice member levels who go above and beyond to support the mission of the IAS. I'm going to reach over you. Excuse me. Oh, let's see.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay. For Wednesday, sorry, y'all. Also, a huge thank you to our current institutional members, which includes, in no particular order, the Department of Art History at Temple University, the Newcomb Art Department at Tulane University, the Department of Art History at Dartmouth College, and the Department of Art and Music Histories at Syracuse University. If you are not yet a member of the IAS and you would like to join us, please join. There's a QR code on your screen, and you can help further support scholarship into Italian art and architecture. We're currently aiming for 600 members at the end of 2026 with our campaign for 600. And of course, thank you to our membership chair, Dr. Nick Camerlengi, and our development chair, Dr. Cheryl Reese, for all of their work on this. We really have an amazing leadership team. And of course, I have to shout out, she's way in the back of the hall now, but our executive vice president, Dr. Kelly Wood, and our executive team really is wonderful, and we make everything here happen. Without further ado, I want to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Sean Roberts. Sean Roberts is a former IAS president. And he was president when I was chair of the Emerging Scholars Committee, so I've known him for a little bit. He is currently teaching professor in the School of Art at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. His essays on Italian prints, maps, paintings, and metalwork have appeared in journals including the Renaissance Studies, Print Quarterly, Source, and Material Culture Review. He is the author of Printing a Mediterranean World, Florence, Constantinople, and the Renaissance of Geography, which is from Harvard in 2013, and is co-editor of 3 books, Visual Cultures of Secrecy in Early Modern Europe from Penn State in 2013, The Seas and the Mobility of Islamic Art from Yale in 2021, and The Environment, Ecology, and Islamic Art also from Yale, from 2023. His works in progress include a biography of the Renaissance map maker, Gerardus Mercator. We had a conversation about pronouncing his first name, set to appear with Recton Books in late 2027, and a scholarly monograph on the Bolognese painter and goldsmith, Francesco Francia. It is this current research on Francia that he will be presenting today with a talk titled Francia, Michelangelo, and the Problem of Metal. Please welcome our 15th annual IAS Press Lecturer, Sean Roberts.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much to Angie, to Lucia, to Rebecca for all the work that she did setting up for us in this event here today. I'm really thankful to the University of Bologna and especially to Fabio Messacesi for the work that he's done in welcoming us, as well as to Federica Muzzarelli for her work in organization. I also want to thank each and every one of you that are present here in the room. It's an awful lot of you, and the huge list of a terrifying number of people that I know online that I've seen there on Zoom. So thank you. Finally, at the outset, I want to extend my thanks to Tim McCall, as some of the ideas presented in this talk have percolated through cooperative work on reevaluating the legacy of Michael Baxendale. Any mistakes are, it goes without saying, my own. Giorgio Vasari told some far-fetched stories about Francesco Raibolini, the man known to him and still today as Il Francia. The most famous of these stravagante, to use his later biographer Carlo Cesare Malvasia's term, was of course the tale that the Bolognese master had died from complications arising after having seen Raphael's Santa Cecilia. Someone needed to unpack the huge panel and to install it at the church of San Giovanni in Monte, and Raphael trusted his friend to do the job. He hardly suspected that the sheer virtuosity of his creation would be such a shocking detriment to Francia's health, causing him to take to bed from sadness and melancholy before expiring some days later. That painting is usually located not too far from us in the Pinacoteca, but it is currently at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York for the Raphael Sublime Poetry exhibition. And here, I show Raphael's great beauty being prepared for its trip in a photo that was published by Finestre Solarde. I suppose at least that we are safe from its Medusa gaze, and I can only hope that none of Manhattan's many aspiring artists will succumb to Francia's fate. The story has been explored recently, and I should add brilliantly, by Elizabeth Cropper and Alessandra Galizzi-Kreugel. Today, I want to talk about another of these tall tales, one slightly less obviously preposterous, but not necessarily more truthful for its seeming credibility. In the second redaction of the Lives of the Artists, printed in 1568, Vasari relates an encounter between his perennial hero Michelangelo and the Bolognese goldsmith and painter Francia. Michelangelo was installing the now, and I should add spectacularly destroyed bronze sculpture of his great benefactor Pope Julius II to be placed above the central portal of San Petronio. The work of 1507 to 1508 is lost today, more on that later. But a rough sense of its appearance has long been recognized in a drawing of the facade. Today in the Louvre, the sheet includes a large enthroned figure directly above the door, and as such, surmounting the lunette containing the Madonna and Child, flanked by Ambrose and Petronius. Very recently, a polychromed limewood sculpture, roughly 70 centimeters tall, originally in a private collection in Nice, but having passed into the hands of an Italian dealer, and now a German buyer, has been proposed as recording the composition. Claims that this represents a modello by Michelangelo himself are beyond my own expertise to fully assess, especially given the lack of his undisputed works in wood, apart from the Santo Spirito crucifix. The expensive acquisition of the now deeply questioned Crocifisso Gallino is surely a reminder of these difficulties. In any case, Francia came to look for himself at the Florentines' colossal work in metal. It is thought to have been between 3 and 4 meters high and weighing nearly 8 tons. Having, quote, heard much of his fame and works, but never having seen any of them, Francia seized the opportunity. On being asked what he thought, he replied that it was a fine casting from beautiful metal. But hearing this, Michelangelo supposed that he was praising the bronze rather than the artist, and remarked to Francia, "I am indebted to Pope Julius, who gave it to me, as you are to the shopkeepers who supply you with your paint." He continued angrily, in the hearing of all men gathered, that Francia was an idiot. Michelangelo's probably apocryphal verbal insult follows a clear pattern for the Lives, driven by Vasari's sense of local Florentine pride, or perhaps, having worked as an outsider in the city in 1539, driven by his complicated odio e amore for Bologna, as Marzia Faetti and others suggested in the Uffizi exhibition of that name in 2018. Seffi Hendler has read a certain anxiety in Michelangelo's response, one which belied both the complications that arose during the casting and later reception, and in her reading, failure, of the artist's most ambitious work in bronze. So too, Michelangelo's debt to Julius must have been a politically charged barb from the later Vasarian vantage point. The expulsion of the Bentivoglio lords in favor of papal authority in 1507 was surely not forgotten, nor the Bentivoglio resurgence in late 1511. Even if ambitious artisans like Francia came to enjoy the patronage of Julius and later Leo, uncertainty must have reigned in these moments of transition, and the particular historical setting of the encounter was a fraught one. Vasari's first stab at the encounter, in the redaction of 1550, presents a more blunt picture of what transpired when Bologna's greatest artist met the Florentine sculptor. In this raw, earlier version, Michelangelo's retort is hardly so eloquent. Instead, when Francia attempts his compliment, the Florentine calls him and, quote, his master Cosa, but he must have meant Lorenzo Costa rather than the by then quite deceased Francesco del Cosa. He called them both idiots. He continues that they should go back to the whorehouse, implying that they were better equipped to judge the wares on display there than they were his art. A version of the tale was, as Malvasia himself realized, also present in Ascanio Condivi's version of Michelangelo's life. The quip about materials and their source, which profoundly inflects the 1568 version, is drawn from Condivi without credit, and crucially, without the latter's favorable notice that Francia was, at the time, seen as the Bolognese Apelles. To that matter, Condivi too presents the entire incident somewhat differently than Vasari, when we consider its context in the life of the artist. It is indeed not integrated into Condivi's chronological narrative, but rather a digression about Michelangelo's capacity for wit. Indeed, the response there is delivered laughingly, and follows a more lighthearted shape in which an anonymous Bolognese gentleman asks whether the colossal Julius is larger than a team of oxen, to which Michelangelo responds that it depends on whether he meant Tuscan or Emilian cattle. Consequently, Condivi does not include Vasari's observation that Francia felt he had been deeply disrespected by those who heard the exchange. More importantly, the episode was, for Condivi, a transition to his discussion of Michelangelo's temperament, health, and body. It is this liminal place in the Vita that explains another moment lifted by Vasari for the second redaction, in which Michelangelo encounters one of Francia's sons, who Vasari knew well had followed their father into painting, and exclaims that, quote, "Your father makes better living boys than he does painted ones." The whole episode, then, is anchored in a consideration of embodiment, and, in Michelangelo's marked, not to say obsessive, rumination on the deterioration of his own body, the aches and pains of which he frequently complained, and which he fervently thought to cast off through the resurrection. Vasari seems himself to have missed some of the nuances of Condivi's account, and perhaps a bit of the complexities that drove Michelangelo. But, at issue, by 1568, and in Vasari's hands, a reported street insult, pitting Michelangelo against a couple of Bolognese rivals, had transformed into occasion for a kind of paragone. Francia is pointedly accused of being a provincial, or perhaps retardataire, Bolognese rube, who commits the cardinal sin of valuing base materials over their transformation through the arts of disegno or the hands of the maker. In short, Francia is held to value gold over skill. Malvasia already knew this story had the whiff of another stravagante and contested it in his preliminary notes for the Felsina Pitrice, which have been explored by Lorenzo Pericolo. The paradigm marshaled here is well known. It may be traced to ancient roots and especially came to be associated with Pliny. Though it was to the natural history that the majority of late 15th and early 16th century commentators turned, it is perhaps more familiar to many later observers from its polemic extrapolation in Leon Battista Alberti's On Painting. Despite the fact that that text was, for some time, neither widely read nor widely available, it is nonetheless important to clarify what Alberti actually wrote on the matter, since it has been the subject of significant misunderstanding and distortion. So, I quote, "There are some who use lots of gold in their Historia. They think it gives majesty. I do not praise it. Even though one should paint Virgil's Dido, whose quiver was of gold, her golden hair knotted with gold, her purple robe gilded with pure gold, the reins of the horse and everything else made of gold, I should not wish gold to be used. For there is more admiration and praise for the painter who imitates the rays with colors. We see on a flat panel and with a gold ground that some spots shine where they ought to be dark and are dark where they ought to be light. Gold distracts not only here from skill, but also can hinder the effects of representation, imitation, and depth by producing brilliant surface effects." The lines that follow have been ignored frequently and are crucial. I would not condemn the other sculptural ornaments joined to the painting, such as columns, carved bases, capitals, and covers, even if they were made of the most pure and solid gold. Even more, a well-perfected Historia deserves ornaments of the most precious gems. Keep in mind that these components, frames, covers, pinnacles, are the larger and sometimes more expensive components of paintings already. They were often commissioned separately and sometimes first, even by years or decades. Crucially, however, a model of artistic evolution hinging on the triumph of imitation and composition over embodiment and materiality stands at the core of perhaps the single most influential primer on Renaissance painting in the English tradition, Michael Baxendall's painting and experience in 15th century Italy. I will return to Baxendall and Alberti and to the web of relationships that sit at the core of the binary woven out of their initially divergent threads. First, though, I want to ask a question that has seldom been given its due. Why did Vasari pin these claims on Francia, a man who, at first glance, seems an unlikely rival to Michelangelo? Francia, of course, was hardly the first artist to come under this particular criticism from Vasari. In fact, an earlier generation of painters, including Florentines, were likewise assailed. Some were those who seem to have outlived their usefulness in a narrative of progressive development, whose later works displayed sensibilities that again looking back from around 40 years later, were demonstrably lacking in haut courant trappings. Perugino serves especially as a holdover from the harshness and sharpness of the second manner, a man whose later paintings seemed glaringly deficient when set alongside Leonardo and Giorgione. The still uncertain connection between those two, who cannot be definitively placed in the same spot despite the contortions of those scholars so invested in influence, will have to be set aside for another day. Problematically, too, Vasari's own desire to draw a direct line of mentorship from Perugino to Raphael, questioned for more than a century, has returned with a vengeance in the current exhibition in New York, exposing the seams of one of the trickier transitions of the early Cinquecento. Yet, it is not only the secco or dryness of the pre-Leonardesque and pre-Raphaelesque manner that seems to motivate these prejudices, nor does it appear to be adequately explained by any simplistic notion of Tuscan campanalismo. To wit, for Vasari, there is something the matter with gold, those who worked it, and especially its intersection with paint. Far more importantly, this problem haunts a tradition of scholarship for centuries in his wake. To that end, something about the conspicuous, glittering flourishes of Cosimo Rosselli's frescoes for the walls of the Sistine Chapel clearly got under the Aretine writer's skin. From a distance of some 6 or 7 decades, Vasari tried to explain away the painter's taste for material opulence, claiming that Cosimo, quote, feeling himself weak in invention and draftsmanship, had sought to conceal his shortcomings by covering his work with the finest ultramarine blues and other lively colors, and had illuminated his scenes with a plentiful amount of gold so that there was no tree or plant or drapery or cloud that was not thus illuminated and flipped. More importantly, Cosimo Rosselli's Midas touch was motivated not entirely by his own uncouth or antiquated tastes, but also by his shrewd recognition that Sixtus IV was, quote, a man who knew little of painting, and must therefore give him the prize of victory. Of course, the Pope, taking the Florentine painter's bait, did indeed judge his contributions, first among those laboring on his chapel. He went so far, in Vasari's tale anyway, so as to force Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and the rest, quote, to spoil all the good work they had done by gilding it, to keep up with the Joneses or Rossellis of the world. If we turn to Cosimo's paintings, we certainly find confirmation of this proliferation of gold, and given his origins in manuscript illumination, we can hardly be surprised. Today in the Accademia of Florence, the altarpiece produced for the city's Compagnia dei Tedeschi for their chapel at Santissimo Annunziata is both confirmation of Vasari's claims and refutation of their blunt inadequacy to evoke how multi-talented multimedia artists employed metallic flourishes. Here, gold serves to enhance the contrast between surface and depth as it stands in for their brocaded curtains parted by angels. Elsewhere, it emphasizes the costly cloaks and robes of the saints, while more surprisingly, it adds a sense of three-dimensionality to the sculpturally ornamented leonine plate armor of the vanquished foe beneath Barbara's feet. The tale of Cosimo Rosselli's garish extravagance is deeply convenient for Vasari, coming to the rescue, as it does, of his more preferred Botticelli. The Aretine's appreciation of the latter painter is fraught, and is forced to overcome his copious use of gold, not just in the Sistine Chapel, but across his entire career. Paul Borowski especially has called attention to the quality of gold in the birth of Venus, the painter's, quote, golden goddess. Vasari, indeed, seems to have skirted uneasily around the edges of this material relationship with the statement that, quote, in those days, there was much commerce between painters and goldsmiths. Botticelli was imbricated in a family tradition of metalwork, and his brother was a gold beater, or barilotto. It was hardly coincidental that the Goldsmiths Guild, that of Sant'Eligio, turned to Sandro for their colossal altarpiece to adorn the chapel at San Marco. Gold dominates this panel, not just in the edges of garments and the patterns across their hems, but especially in its heavenly upper register, where literally golden rays threaten to dematerialize the beautiful angelic youths of the heavenly host. There is probably no better example of that kind of commerce between those arts as Francia. Vasari knew this well. In contrast to the cameo he provided in the life of Michelangelo, the Vita of Francia is, for the most part, laudatory, the bizarre death by Raphael accepted. The life is repeated wholesale in the early pages of Malvasia's own life of Francia. Contrary, perhaps even to Malvasia's own predilections, the life of Francia is to an extraordinary extent focused on metal. Over the course of a 40-year career, Francia oversaw Bologna's preeminent goldsmith's shop. Though known as Erafi, in fact, such craftsmen worked primarily in brass and silver, gilding their wares as necessary to provide costly and flashy effects. So too, Francia supervised the city's mint, or zecca, a job trusted only to the most established and reliable in that trade. Eventually, too, he established himself as among the most sought-out painters in Italy. When the 10-year-old Federico Gonzaga was paraded through Bologna on his way to surrender as a papal hostage, it was to Francia that Isabella d'Este turned for a portrait of her son. Possibly pertinent to our discussion today, she did, however, have to send the panel back to Francia for corrections, as she felt he had gone a bit far in exaggerating the blondness of the boy's hair, quite possibly with the sorts of gold streaks he used so frequently in his depiction of women saints like the Magdalene and the beautiful youths of the Bentivoglio princes. While this latter occupation of painting has long been prominent, even and problematically for his champion Malvasia, the image of Francia as goldsmith is today coming into clearer focus. We are all, of course, indebted to Emilio Negro and Nicosetta Royal's comprehensive catalog of his works and those of his continuing family workshop. But much credit is owed to the organizers of the 2018 exhibition here at the Pinacoteca. It was certainly for me, and I suspect for many of us, an eye-opening experience. While the ostensible connection to his pupil Marcantonio Raimondi's engravings has still not fully resolved itself, despite Naoko Takahataki's Herculean efforts, the sheer quality of Francia's extant metalwork, when viewed up close, is remarkable. Vasari claimed that what he, quote, delighted above all in, and in which he was truly excellent, was the making of dyes for metals, wherein he was the rarest master of his day. The portrait medal of Francesco Alidosio, papal legate and bishop of Bologna, Francia's one generally accepted autograph surviving medal, confirms Vasari's own acknowledgement that these portraits seemed, quote, alive. The confident gaze, the assured modeling of the overhanging brow, and the near sfumato of the subtle transition from the lower eyelid to nose all rival the best painted portraits of the moment. They add a striking naturalism to the momentary liveliness provided by the forelock that slips from beneath the sitter's cap. The reverse presents an inventive emblem of Jupiter, thunderbolts in hand, upon an eagle-drawn sky chariot. Vasari asked his reader to compare these medals to those of Caradosso, Cristoforo Papa. I will only add that to my eyes, Francia's portrait of Alidosio is superior to those of his now better-known rival in this art. So too, we see the continuation of these practices into the minting of coins, not just for the Bentivoglio, but also for Julius and Leo. Though necessarily lacking the sculptural range of his medals, coins like the double ducat struck for Giovanni II Bentivoglio, at least when preserved in good condition, are among the most naturalistic minted on the peninsula. So too, Francia and his shop seem to have decorated and especially gilded armor. The most compelling example of his accomplishments in that art is the Bentivoglio shield, a targone in form, today in Bologna's Museo Civico Medievale. A wooden armature covered in thin animal skin has been fairly encased in a glistening golden field upon which St. George rides. Francia's activities, considered in the aggregate, have often borne the stigma of the eclectic, though that word is scarcely employed to describe the broad output of Perugino's operations in Florence and Perugia, and practically never to denote Raphael's diversified workshop in Rome. Even the 2018 exhibition at the Pinacoteca used this term in gathering Francia's oeuvre under a suitably large umbrella. It may be worth asking if anything here is really so unexpected or disorganized. Works in brass, silver and gold, stained glass, miniature painting, altarpieces, engravings, and liturgical furnishings may, in fact, be reasonably grouped as the wares of a coherent bottega, consider that of Ghirlandaio as a comparanda. So long as we do not adhere too insistently to anachronistic notions of attribution, or too romantically to fixation on the artist's hand, these activities are, in their variety, hardly extraordinary. Eclectic, then, applied to Francia, is an infelicitous substitute for wide-ranging, organized, and collaborative, all labels used to praise his better-known Tuscan and Roman peers. A contemporary source confirms to a great extent the high appraisal of the goldsmith and his works in metal. Describing the wedding of Annibale II Bentivoglio and Lucrezia d'Este in 1487, the panegyrist Angelo Michele Salimbeni tells us that Francia, quote, surpasses Polygnotus with his brush and Phidias in sculpture. Salimbeni's praise is situated among a description of precious gifts made for the wedding. The poet had never seen so many and varied cases containing jewelry, necklaces, and vessels. Those lavish gifts offered to the couple were sent from the city, its villages and castles, and are described as being as numerous as the stars. The variety and quantity of the objects at the Bentivoglio wedding Salimbeni describes, and his praise for Francia, is hardly an outlier case. The humanists of Bologna are fairly unified in their estimation of the goldsmith and his pedagone with antiquity. Crucially, the notice in the epithalamium has at times been used ironically to dematerialize Francia's art by the mistaken identification of the subject of praise as printmaking, a problem first recognized by Jeremy Warren, who sensibly instead read Salimbeni as praising the relationship between goldsmith's work and sculpture. To this, I would add that the comparison to Polygnotus is apt. Pliny attributed a number of significant innovations to that painter, including, like Vasari's descriptions of Francia's medals, the gift of lifelikeness to faces through the introduction of expressions, including frowning, and the mastering of the open mouth. Salimbeni also compares Francia to the Florentine Maso Finiguerra for his skill with the burin. That facility was most directly connected with making yellow plaques, in which both artists specialized, incising lines upon silver plates to be filled with black enamel. Two stunning examples of Francia's accomplishments in this medium are present at the Pinacoteca, one a crucifixion and the other a resurrection. Both have been connected with Bentivoglio weddings, though they sit uneasily in a stylistic chronology, and both index a certain fluidity between the arts of drawing and sculptural facility. The elaborate framing of the crucifixion, in particular, does indeed make a strong case for its connection to familial alliance, and would have represented exactly the sort of glittering gift described by Salimbeni. We can well imagine that such precious, intimate objects serves not only the needs of patrons, but also the ambitions of an artist intent on a conspicuous display of skill, which embraced material lavishness rather than holding it at arm's length. Despite the suggestion of their genesis in courtly marital culture, it is also worth remembering that these are, at core, liturgical objects, paxes utilized to visually transfer the kiss of peace from priest to parishioners. As such, these, or others now lost to us, would certainly have held a treasured place within the city's churches and by its clergy. The quality of disegno on display in these small plaques helps explain one of Malvasia's more polemic claims within the life of Marcantonio Raimondi. He disputes Vasari's claim that the great engraver must have earlier passed through Rome and there acquired the training that made him a ready collaborator for Raphael. Instead, in the Fassinapitrice, Francia's disegno alone was enough to ready Marcantonio to produce his early masterpieces. Quote, therefore, prior to engraving works by Raphael, Marcantonio did not have the need presumed by Vasari to pass through Rome. Most importantly, Marcantonio must have learned enough about drawing in Bologna under his master Francia if early on, immediately after his arrival at the court of Rome, he engraved his first Roman Lucretia, end quote. Despite his suggestion of Roman training, Vasari betrays a certain awareness of the truth in this observation, because both he and Malvasia agree that Marcantonio was called De Franci, so closely was he connected to his former master's practice. On then to the elephant in the room, Francia's paintings, which, whatever their merits, were, at least for Vasari, mortally undone by unboxing Cecilia. Consider the enthroned Madonna and Child, produced for the Manzuoli family's chapel at the Misericordia. Here, around 1490, we see one of the Bentivoglio lord's reliable aristocratic allies, following perhaps not glaringly, but still notably in the footsteps of those like Sixtus IV or Florence's Compagnie dei Tedeschi, who preferred a bit of golden dazzle. Gold highlights, almost like the metal-wrapped threads of brocades, streak across the angel's shoulder-length blonde hair, and the sunlight catches the folds of St. Augustine's vestments, even providing a golden glow as they reflect in the mail coat of the armored St. George. If anything, these flourishes were amplified rather than muted nearly a decade later in the Adoration of the Infant Christ commissioned by Anton Galeazzo Bentivoglio. Here, it is not only the angels and saints, but the young Bentivoglio lords whose hair is tinseled, too blonde, as it were, for Isabella d'Este's taste. The landscape beyond is sun-drenched, and, as Vasari griped about Cosimo Rosselli, no tree or plant is not thus illuminated. Francia's paintings, then, like those of Perugino, Costa, share something of what Vasari saw for the last quarter of the 15th century as old-fashioned. A new style had burst forth from Giorgione and Leonardo to Raphael that made living fossils of these men. And yet, if we believe our own eyes, something new is also emerging here in the best of the Bolognese masters' panels. Consider the enthroned Madonna commissioned in 1490 by Bartolomeo Fericini for his family's chapel, also in the Misericordia. My observations will be limited to the center of the panel, given the significant retouches which added extra saints to the now crowded and right and left sides of the throne. There is gold, to be sure, in this unquestioned masterpiece of the Pinacoteca. The lunette above the Virgin seems perhaps to mimic gilded stucco. The hem of her cloak dances flamboyantly behind the blonde lute-playing angel, among the most straightforwardly pleasant passages in 15th century art. Yet ornament here, if that is what we want to call these ribbons and rays, cohabitates with an almost Flemish capacity to capture the granular surfaces of things in oil paint. Initially divergent, but hardly contradictory tendencies toward decoration on the one hand and mimesis on the other converge in the gigantic gem. Set within a gold frame and augmented with a dangling pearl pendant, it hangs just above the head of the Madonna. So striking, so unexpected is this intrusion into the Sacra Conversazione that the panel as a whole was sometimes known as the Paola de Gioiello. Far from a break then with Albertian prescriptions, painting here receives the, quote, ornaments of the most precious gems, which the writer insisted it deserves. Despite such virtuosity, and a pivotal place in the visual and material fabric of one of the peninsula's most vibrant cultural centers, Francia's position in both the scholarly tradition and popular conception outside of Emilia is middling at best. This is especially true when compared to his Roman, Milanese, and Florentine contemporaries, indebted as these remain to Alberti, Vasari, and their later admirers. The close relations between painters and goldsmiths has continued to find only an uncomfortable space within broader narratives of the development of Cinquecento painting. By the moment of Francia's triumph and the triumphs of Bolognese art under the Bentivoglio, we are no longer in what Vasari called those days. Undoubtedly, the most influential and often persuasive proponent of the trajectory against the aesthetic value of gold and metal in the later 15th and early 16th centuries was Michael Baxendale. More than any other Anglophone art historical work, Painting and Experience in 15th century Italy introduced generations of students and scholars to a patron who, quote, seems to have made his opulent gestures more and more by becoming a conspicuous buyer of skill. Of course, Baxendale provided the immediate caveat that not all clients did so. But following Vasari, he more or less sealed the fate of those like Sixtus and the Bentivoglio lords, excluding them from, quote, enlightened buyers of skill, spurred on by an increasingly articulate sense of the artist's individuality, end quote. It was the influence of this individual that guided truly innovative paintings into a Renaissance future freed from the gilded baggage of the medieval. Implicitly, this fixated on Tuscan painting. Indeed, Baxendale's 15th century Italy is deeply misleading, as his evidence is drawn so wholly from Florence, and his period eye so deeply that of the city's merchant class. Emilian painting, I'm sure you will not be surprised, goes unmentioned. Of course, I do not mean to be unfair to Baxendale, and it is probably safe to say that the legacy of Painting and Experience is comfortably safe from any criticism I can muster here today. The eloquence with which Baxendale described both the fabric of Florentine's social life and the paintings that refracted, portrayed, and even resisted it remains deeply valuable. Likewise, if the period eye has proved in need of reevaluation along the critical lines of gender, class, and geography, the concept's centrality to the field's expanding commitment to a historicized and cognitive reception of visual culture remains vital. Moreover, the decision to ground a history of style, at least in part, in commercial considerations, was bold, and its findings admirably sensible at a moment in which the economic history of art was in an unabashedly lamentable condition. It is remarkable, to say the least, that Painting and Experience arrived less than a decade after the miserable final volume of Arnold Hauser's Social History of Art. Baxendall's evidence seems lifted from the pages of a present-day study of cultural economy when compared to deterministic proclamations that, quote, as early as the 15th and 16th centuries, a leading position was held all over Europe by an art of predominantly middle-class character. It was not until that later Renaissance and age of Mannerism and Baroque that its place was taken by works in the courtly style, end quote. Hauser's reliance on stylistic and chronological abstractions, his reification of broad class constructs, the sheer vulgarity of his generalizations do not rear their head in Baxendall's works. Painting and Experience, too, provided palatable middle ground between Hauser and Hall and the heirs of aesthetes like Reggie Turner, who had characterized, quote, poor old Herbert Horn's archival methods as poring over Botticelli's washing bills and always a shirt missing. I acknowledge also that it would be perverse to argue too stridently that the author of the limewood sculptures of Renaissance Germany helped to devalue the material. Indeed, in another register, it is precisely that account of interaction with the materials, down to the microscopic structure of trees, that inspired Pamela H. Smith and a powerful epistemological shift in understanding Renaissance artisans, their works, and worlds. Nonetheless, if Baxendall's history of Renaissance art and decades of scholarship pulled into its wake is far from an immaterial one, it is all the same a history that tracks dematerialization, that insists that what really matters about Renaissance painting, at least, is fundamentally a new set of values, centered on skill and inventiveness, and skeptical of, if not hostile to, a vulgar sensuality of precious materials appropriate to the nouveau riche or simply the ignorant. It is worth acknowledging here that some historical inaccuracy and some twists of logic are necessary to reach that conclusion, which has sometimes been seen as self-evident. Baxendall posits a 15th century shortage of gold, one which has scant historical basis, as a precondition. More troubling, even if such a shortage has arisen, the notion that powerful patrons would thus see precious material as less valuable and attempt to distance themselves from their use defies anthropological sense. When we are forced to ask ourselves, has decreased access to a luxurious good ever made it less desirable? More crucially, what are we to make of the continuation of a goldsmith painter like Francia? And what are we to make of his polemic pairing with Michelangelo? This is hardly a knot that is easily untied. Baxendall addressed Francia only once in his published works, an extremely short note in the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes, co-authored with Ernst Gombrich, that hoped to make sense of antiquarian panegyric of the sort advanced by Salimbeni. At issue, the scholars looked to find some plausible explanation in the conventions of rhetoric for what seemed to them unwarranted praise for the unremarkable and old-fashioned Francia. They tried, in particular, to rescue Filippo Beroaldo, noting that, quote, the degree of enthusiasm expressed by Bolognese humanists for the work and personality of Francesco Francia has more than once been pointed out. The comparison to Apelles, made in 1494 by Niccolo Barzi and repeated by Condivi, they call, quote, severely overstrained, and they admire Bartolomeo Bianchini for being, quote, a little more moderate. That basic sense of embarrassment characterized Gombrich's attempts to understand the rhetoric of 15th century artistic praise overall. He famously felt that the hyperbole of Quattrocento poets needed a great deal of explanation. A much more cited article, dedicated to descriptions of the Cassone painter Apollonio di Giovanni, tried to excuse Ugolino Verino's praise for that, by the 20th century, unknown painter as the Florentine Apelles. What if Gombrich and Baxendall, for all their erudition, missed the mark here? What if the idea that such descriptions were mere rhetoric too fully guided their sensibilities? The problem is not just one of ancient history, and it can't be safely confined to art history's distant past. If Painting and Experience appeared 50 years ago, the paradigm of a rise of buying skill rather than gold has proved persistent. Consider David Landau and Peter Parshall's description of the rise of printmaking. Quote, but in the Renaissance, these arts were gradually improving their status and shedding their material and procedural identities. The essence of this change was the reviving perception of the arts as primarily a medium of imitation and illusion, in effect, an element in which materials were less salient than the transformations performed upon them. Prints entered the stage at just the time that these changes were coming about, end quote. We still want to prove that something changed profoundly in this critical moment. That change, though, is troubled by the uneasy place of metal and perhaps even of substance in a trajectory from Vasari to Baxendal and beyond, a trajectory which was not successfully intercepted by Malvasia. The great Bolognese biographer invested his energies in debunking Vasari's lies, and as a result, fell into a trap of his own making by inaccurately extending Francia's life significantly, and of correcting the perceived slander of Raphael's absolute absolute priority over Francia. In doing so, however, Malvasia invested deeply and even myopically in the paintings of a man who never stopped identifying himself first and foremost as a goldsmith. Here, in the deposition today in Parma's Galleria Nazionale, we see the continuity of his signature as out effects into the second decade of the 16th century, a motif further punctuated by the metal of the nails of the Alma Christi here. We see such an evocation of the goldsmith within the painter too, at the base of the little hill on which the Virgin stands in the Pala Annunziata of 1500. Turning to modeling within the late deposition, to the fictions of three-dimensionality and of light, we see too the continued attention to the sorts of things crafted by goldsmiths, the conspicuous bangle on the Magdalene's wrist, but also their echo in the literally golden highlights in her flowing hair. It is in these passages that Francia's paintings come alive, and it is why they have often photographed so very badly. Details can capture their luminescence, but reproductions rarely do the full composition's justice. Francia's sons, in contrast, though continuing his workshop for decades following their father's death, mostly embraced a more lackluster approach. Their signatures eschew the long connection to goldsmith's work, adopting simply the moniker Il Francia, as seen on this little banderole, cotton thorns, near a dove at the base of their San Frediano altarpiece from Santa Maria delle Grazie. Let us return to Vasari's strange pairing of Francia with Michelangelo. A natural, at least for Vasari, contrast might have been provided by juxtaposing the heroic sculptural masculinity of the Florentine with the imitative Flemish qualities of the Bolognese master. Francisco de Holanda's fictional Michelangelo provides a model for such invective, and it is possible that some trace of that polemic emerges in Condivi's pairing of Michelangelo and Francia's confrontation with his discussion of the artist's body and with the disjunction between those of Francia's paintings and the living bodies of his sons. Famously, in de Holanda's dialogue, Michelangelo skewers northern oil painting as only fit for Germans, women, and the clergy. A direct connection might reasonably be drawn to those northern traditions through the early, though unconfirmed legend that Francia had taken the name by which he came to be known as an homage to his first mentor in metalworking, a French goldsmith named Duc. Vasari seems, however, to have been unaware of this particular line of invective, and it remains at most beneath the surface in both his life of Francia and that of Michelangelo. In any case, leaving aside the obvious misogyny of Holanda's claims, it is surely true that the Bentivoglio were no priests or choir boys. So too, if Flemish naturalism might be construed as transparent and simplistic by some, it represented for others precisely the re-emergence of the sort of painting Pliny had championed. Would not men and birds alike be fooled by the perching avians of Francia's Pala Annunziata? Michelangelo is also an odd mouthpiece for an argument in favor of disembodiment or dematerialized skill over the stuff of the arts and their procedural identities. Consider the time he spent identifying appropriate marble deposits for his large-scale projects, including Julius's ill-fated tomb. This is, too, the man who saw in his project for the facade of Florence's San Lorenzo a veritable resurrection of the very profession of stoneworking. The works there, he exclaimed, would, quote, resuscitate the dead, domesticate the mountains, and introduce industry in this country, Tuscany. For that matter, it is hard to believe that the man who joked that he had imbibed the art of carving from the milk of his wet nurse, the wife of a stonecutter in Settignano, was so touchy about the threads connecting material to skill. Nor even was a direct connection between Michelangelo's own arte and gold unthinkable. Pietro Aretino lauded the playing card maker Domenico Padovano as the Michelangelo of his craft, in large part precisely for the innovation, as the Scourge of Princes saw it anyway, of adding gold to these once humble objects of daily use. A hint, however, of what might have motivated Vasari's prejudices against Francia's works, and which helped enable the long tradition of Baxandall and other scholars' distrust for gold, may be provided in a seemingly innocuous observation. In explaining Francia's shift from metalwork to painting, which of course was not actually a chronological development, but a simultaneous and continuous practice, Vasari had this to say. Quote, he also enameled many works in silver, which were destroyed at the time of the ruin and exile of the Bentivoglio. There may be some truth to this, though we have already seen that some of these princely objects survived. It certainly was true of Michelangelo's Colossus at San Petronio, though not by the papal partisans who had sacked the palace of Bologna's lords, but rather by the Bentivoglio's supporters following the family's triumphant return in 1511. It was at that point that the bronze effigy of Julius was, according to the most dramatic accounts, broken into pieces, its head thrown into the square. From there, the disembodied bronze fragments were sent to a delighted Alfonso d'Este. Despite our frequent impression of the Ferrarese lord as precisely one of Baxandall's better sort of patrons, Alfonso had no interest whatsoever in any lingering aura of Michelangelo's artistry. Instead, the metal was gleefully melted down and recast into a large artillery piece ribaldly named after the Pope, La Giulia. The gun, too, does not survive, having itself later succumbed to that same inherent fungibility. I show instead the similarly personified cannon of San Paolo, cast by Cosimo Ceni for Ferdinando II de' Medici, and now ornamenting the cortile of the Bargello. Likewise, Titian's portrait of Alfonso with his bronze artillery trophy is lost, but a copy of the composition survives at the Met in New York. The fear that one's life in metalwork might come to nothing is a specter that haunts Vasari's lives, and it is neither Francia nor Michelangelo who provide its most strident polemic. That prize goes instead to Antonio del Palaiolo, who, again, almost certainly apocryphally, abandons his work as a goldsmith to take up painting, believing that his panels will provide a lasting fama which metal cannot. This has some truth as well. It is worth admitting that this calculation, when what is basically true when one looks retrospectively upon Palaiolo's career, and Vasari was, it's important to remember, looking retrospectively. Many panels by Palaiolo are known, like the Hercules that we see here. In contrast, the man who secured some of the most lucrative and prestigious commissions for ecclesiastical metalwork in Florence is known mostly through preliminary drawings and fragments, like the plaquettes for the San Gaggio cross, mostly stripped of their luminescent enamel. And yet, Vasari's general principle fails to account for Francia's story. Ironically, while some of his most valuable works in metal survive, much of his frescoes can be seen only in tiny fragments, precious in what they tell us about his accomplishments in that medium, yet deeply melancholy in their ruined state. In an almost perverse inversion of Vasari's Life of Francia, it is not so much his goldsmith's work, but his paintings that were lost when the Bentivoglio regime fell to a pro-papal mob. This bit of fresco, isolated and framed in the Pinacoteca today, is all that remains of a monumental scene of Judith and Holofernes that adorned the walls of the Bentivoglio Palace. What of Renaissance metalwork today and the intersections of materiality and artifice? From a certain vantage point, it seems we have turned a corner. The notion of Michelangelo's failures in bronze, or his uneasiness with a process that was so divorced from the hand which channeled the fiat lux of creation, or which left its traces on the rough surface of the Rondinini Pietà, does not appear to bother today's buyers much. Who doesn't want Michelangelo bronzes? The master's collaboration with Daniele de Volterra for the lost bronze David has resurfaced as a central concern for scholars. We too find Michelangelo's sculptures in metal hiding in plain sight. The mounted Rothschild panthers, about which I make no claim, are only the most spectacular example. If many doubts remain about individual works, and Nicholas Penny's measured response is perhaps our best guide, the general tenor of a Michelangelo who engaged with metals and their embrace of the market is clear. We occupy, for better or worse, a flashier age, perhaps willing to remake its heroes in the image of men like Francia, artisans of extraordinary skill, bound to the fungible metallic value of the stuff they worked and the whims of those they worked for. Tim McCall has called attention not just to the gilded accoutrements of Quattrocento lords, which he described as shaping their brilliant bodies, but also to the conspicuous extravagance even of Black clothing, liberating it from long presumed assumptions with a somber tone towards Spanish aestheticism. So too, Catherine Cavese and McCall have embarked on a multi-volume history of luxury that will bridge the golden pleasures of the past with those of the contemporary jet set. Goldsmiths find themselves once again at the forefront of our scholarly consideration, as in Shira Brisbane's brilliant new study of Christoph Jamnitzer. Gold as substance, meaningful, and bridging making, knowing, and economy lies at the core of Rebecca Zorak's transformative interventions into both French and Italian art. And an increasingly globalized Renaissance confronts us anew with the near universal currency of precious metals and the potential celebrity of those who worked them. It is hardly coincidental that the one named artisan who migrated from India to the Iberian metropole during the period was the goldsmith Raoul Chatim. Still, the work of which Francia, and indeed Bologna, was so proud, remains something of a footnote to histories which remain invested in a renaissance of Italian painting, yet which persistently overlay that renaissance with Tuscan assumptions, filters, and prejudices, an almost gravitational need to return time and again to an Albertian, Vasarian, and perhaps Baxendalian definition of painting, it seems, has not yet lost its luster. Thank you very much.
That's fair. For the Q&A. Okay, I'll say it.
So take questions from the room, and those of you on Zoom, hopefully you all can hear me. You can put them in the chat, and then we will bring them to the room. So does anyone want to start us off? Nobody else has a book? Oh, I see one. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I just noted a few things down, so if you don't mind, I read it just because it's easier.
Yeah, no problem.
So now I was finding it very interesting that you mentioned liminal status of the French, and also that it's nicknamed derived from a French master.
Yeah.
And it was equally interesting that Vasari in the life praises Francia, but also when he has to like make a comparison with Michelangelo, basically ruthlessly
Yeah, sure.
So I was wondering if do you believe that Vasari's reputation was also a way to reject a fact that Francia was like a foreigner?
Yeah. So
From the Tuscan.
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's something that I am certainly starting to explore. One kind of bit of information to have in the background there, I think, is that so many workers in metal were indeed transplants, really all over Italy. That Compagnia dei Tedeschi, who commissioned Cosimo Rosselli's altarpiece, so many of them were artillery casters. And that painting of Santa Barbara standing over a plate armored fallen foe is a kind of reference to her as the patron saint of artillery as well at that moment. So I think it is very possible that we don't just have a connection between a certain mode of potentially foreign Flemish oil painting there, but also a potential foreignness in metalworking, which is not to say that Vasari believes that everyone working in metal was a German, right, or a northerner of some sort. But absolutely, I think that idea of foreignness does seem to be present there somewhere, lingering, I think. Yeah, absolutely. And it's something I'm really interested in exploring further. So thank you so much.
And I have another one.
Sure.
Maybe go ahead. Notice you've also mentioned the relationship between Raimondi and Raphael.
Yep.
So just because it's something I'm really interested in as well. And everyone, they were painting with delle, in Showmaker and everyone. And so I would like to ask you, what's your opinion? We should behind it. Do you think there were collaborators? It was just using drawings and putting them into engravings, or was re-elaborating them?
Yeah, that is a very, very, as you know, that's a question that no one, I think, has fully answered, because no one has the kind of smoking gun document that they would like there, right? So, you know, to go back to the 15th century, a little bit earlier, absolutely nobody was willing to believe that Andrea Mantegna was collaborating to make his engravings until those documents came to light. And there are still people who, even though we have those literal kinds of contracts, right, are not willing to see that kind of collaboration, I think. To me, in thinking about that relationship, it makes a great deal of sense to think about at least the directness of a kind of collaboration in which drawings of the critical components are being provided by Raphael to Marcantonio, right? And in which that Lucrezia obviously becomes not just Lucrezia, but other figures as well, moving forward in Marcantonio's set of works. And I also think that the question that still has to be answered in some ways about Marcantonio is what the relationship was between he and Francia in the compositions that he has, like his Baptism of Christ, which repeat components of Francia's paintings, right? It seems that despite Francia's obvious facility in the parallel technique of Niello, there doesn't seem to be any reason to believe that Francia was himself engraving any plates for printing. Whether Marcantonio was doing that at an early point, I think remains an open question there. But if he was, it suggests that he already brought a certain sense of a collaborative spirit working in that kind of larger operation to his encounters with Raphael. Yeah.
I'll ask you a
Yeah.
question. It almost is giving me, like, in our contemporary rise of neo-fascism, it's giving me the quiet luxury trend, where we're seeing the, at that time, it would have been the aristocracy who were getting more wealth, but finding that wealth more precarious, possibly. And I was wondering if that is just something that popped into my head, that there's not a connection, but outside of just like nationalism amongst the different city-states, I wonder if there's other kind of political shifts that might explain why that was so much more important in places like Florence, but not for the patrons here in Bologna.
So I think that what I would say is that I think runs into a much longer standing question of how we think about style and politics between republics and courts and other forms of government, right? And I hesitate to jump too directly in on the politics of that, only because there has often been a mapping of bad taste and bad style onto somehow the princes and the courts of the North, or even just elsewhere outside of a certain Republican ideal, right? And one of the challenges with that is not so much that I care about saving the artistic reputation of Borso d'Este, which doesn't matter that much to me, but instead that it can troublingly lead to an idea that there is a direct and readable connection between a certain sort of reduction of that kind of ornament and a certain notion of austerity, and a reading of that onto what might be perceived as more virtuous Republican politics, which are in fact themselves deeply, as we would see them, oligarchic, patriarchal, and which build into them no more liberty that are necessarily enjoyed by the subjects of Ferrara or the Bentivoglio in Bologna, I think. So no, I mean it's a good question, and it's certainly it's there in the back of my mind, floating around. Absolutely, yeah.
Question from online.
Okay.
Comes from Pat Simons
Oh, hey,
in
Pat.
conversation with Sally.
Yes.
How might the training in goldsmithery shape the work of artists who later worked in other media, rather than regard this as a move away from a minor medium, or to think about it only in terms of early experience with disegno? How might a study of, quote, goldsmithery and experience be framed?
Yeah, that's as I mean, it's a
So Sally bringing those to test.
yeah, no, thank you both for the question, which is a really good question, and so partially one immediate intervention there would be the reminder that I suspect we all kind of have in the back of our minds, that so many painters, so many artisans across a really wide spectrum did initially train in goldsmithing in one way or another, right? And many of them already inherit not just some sensibilities from that, but probably very importantly, what we would think about as kind of what Pam Smith always talks about as the artisanal epistemologies of working in gold. And so I suspect that while we sometimes want to overread these kinds of movements away from those early forms of training and early knowledge, that they're probably actually a critical backbone, even for people like Vasari, who are trying then to disavow them in a wide range of ways. Now, again, where that desire to disavow comes from is that much more problematic question. But I think the idea that those skills often are already present there, rather than that what we see are somehow a chronological movement away from goldsmithing and into painting, is probably really important in terms of how we try to think about this, right? So I have to collect my thoughts on that a little more, but that's my initial stab at that off the top of my head.
Yeah, not the big. How much of this comes down to the what might call a guild war between the older groups, the goldsmith skills, the Vasari's desire to found this new academic. How much of it is his interest to sort of build ability, knowledge, training of this new machine, and move away from this?
Right. So absolutely also sitting in the background and unmentioned in my talk, but Sean, you're right to bring it up, is of course what might be seen as a broader invective against the bottega, against the workshop as model, right? And indeed in favor of the establishment of the academia. Some of that, I think, too, comes down to questions about how we think about guild openness and secrecy in these kinds of moments, right? Because there are in fact two competing paradigms of how we think about that problem. One of them is a paradigm which is to a great extent supported by Vasari and by the Grand Dukes, which is a paradigm that says some kind of academia is going to be essentially a much more open, visible kind of resource that is going to shortcut in some ways, that is going to work around the natural vindictiveness of artists, right? Vasari is deeply concerned with that question of envy and rivalry and sees it as something that is retarding the arts in certain ways in what he's looking at. And that in many ways is why he paints his envy, rivalry, and fortune on the ceiling of the main room in his own house, right? Is thinking about that problem in those ways. Some historians of the guilds, some economic historians of the guilds, on the other hand, have approached this in a very different direction and have argued instead that actually guild policing by themselves and guild inspections actually made the bottega far more than, not perhaps the academia, but certainly far more than the studio, a visible space where certain kinds of things could be learned and operations could be verified. So I think absolutely that polemic against workshop, against bottega, and potentially against guild is present there in a number of the choices that Vasari makes, especially in 1568, right? Especially as that story, in this case, that very small story in the life of Michelangelo, is transformed into a much more pointed episode. Yes, I think the academia and the hopes for it are behind that to some extent. Absolutely. Thank you.
We probably had time for one more question. Yes.
Thanks so much for such a great talk. I was curious, since we have such a large presence of our student community and Scuola di Specializzazione, if maybe you can talk a little bit about the research process of where you are in this project. I know it's a work in progress. They are planning to expand and also publish a book. I think it would be interesting to kind of conclude and shifting here, talking about the research method and approach that inform your arguments and your project.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to talk about how it came about and how I've been working on it. I think the project began in it really began in two different directions. One of them, as I suggested at the beginning, was a direction that was about historiography, a direction that was about scholarship, a direction that was about asking why a certain idea was still so common in especially English language treatments of painting at the end of the 15th century. And that's been something that I'm thinking through, not only with Francia and maybe not even primarily with Francia, but instead, as I think you could see here in part with Cosimo Rosselli and with Botticelli, and even with how that works within that late 15th century Florentine environment. The other genesis for the project, though, in many ways, was wanting to read any kind of comprehensive account about Francia's life and works, and finding that while we have that great comprehensive catalog raisonné by Negro and Royo, that no real meaty narrative of that life existed. That the last attempt to really do that in English was a short book from the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And so partially I came at it by saying, I am deeply interested in these paintings and metalwork, and certainly seeing as much of them in person as possible everywhere, and wanting to have something that would, I think, better represent the range and the quality of that, particularly given the centrality of Francia to a city like Bologna, and to the ways in which there's something strange, I think, about the continued downplaying of Emilian painting compared to Tuscan painting, and that's part of where I started to come at it from. The other thing I think to say about the project is that my own interest with it has coincided with the very large ongoing work that's being done out of the Center for Advanced Study of the Visual Arts in Washington, D.C., that's been spearheaded by Elizabeth Cropper and by Lorenzo Pericolo in trying to translate, annotate, illustrate, and really get to the bottom of essentially the entirety of Malvasia's Faustina Pietrice. And so in many ways, I've been very fortunate that their work has been going on at the same time, that their volume on the earliest painters, including Francia, has appeared at this point as a really important resource. And one of the nice things about that is that the vast amount of archival work that sits in the background of that work can now, I'm hoping for so many scholars, can kind of serve as a jumping off platform so that we have a lot more work on these Bolognese painters going forward. But at the same time, there's a desperate need to do that work on the ground. I'm not kidding when I say that so many of these works either reproduce very badly or are just almost never reproduced in the level of detail that one really needs to kind of study these things. And so it's an incredible privilege to be here in Bologna and looking at these things. And of course, that's a privilege that your students have all the time, which is the wonderful, wonderful thing about studying at a university like this. So yeah, yes, thank you.